You know the word, you can see the face, you can almost hear their voice, but the name stays locked. Why does your brain hold it hostage? The first person to describe this state in print was the American psychologist William James. In his 1890 book, The Principles of Psychology, he called it the feeling of being on the verge of a name. It was a distinct mental feeling, he wrote, separate from simply not knowing. James observed that the feeling often carried a specific rhythm or shape. You could sense the word's length, its starting sound, even its stress pattern. But the actual name remained just out of reach. He compared it to an empty space in your consciousness that aches to be filled. This description stood for decades without a proper name of its own. The phenomenon stayed nameless until 1966. That year, two psychologists at Harvard, Roger Brown and David McNeill, gave it a name. They called it the tip-of-the-tongue state. Brown and McNeill designed the first experiment to study it directly. They read participants' definitions of obscure English words like ambergris or sampan. Participants who could not recall the word were asked if they were in a tip-of-the-tongue state. If yes, they were asked to guess the word's first letter and number of syllables. The results changed how we think about memory. Nearly half of those in a tip-of-the-tongue state correctly guessed the first letter. A third correctly guessed the syllable count. Some even recognized the word from a list of similar-sounding words. The name was missing, but its skeleton was still intact. Brown and McNeill's experiment revealed something fundamental about memory. It is not a single box you open or fail to open. Memory is layered. The meaning of the word, its semantic layer, is already retrieved. You know what you want to say. You can describe it, define it, visualize it. But the sound of the word, its phonological layer, is not connected. The two layers are stored separately in the brain. The semantic retrieval happens before the phonological retrieval. When the bridge between them breaks, you get a tip-of-the-tongue state. This is why you can give the word's definition but not its sound. A question then arises. If the information is there, why can't you access it? One answer came from a theory called the blocking hypothesis. It suggests that similar-sounding words intrude and block the target. When you try to retrieve a name, your brain activates a set of phonologically similar candidates. Most of the time, these candidates are suppressed. But sometimes, a wrong candidate is strong enough to interfere. You might find yourself stuck with a word that sounds close but is wrong. The correct name feels like it is behind that blocking word. The more similar the intruder, the stronger the block. This explains why tip-of-the-tongue states are more common for proper names. Proper names have no synonyms. There is no other way to say the same person. The link between a face and a name is arbitrary and one-to-one. If that link fails, there is no backup route. A different explanation came from the transmission deficit hypothesis. It was developed by psychologists Deborah Burke and Donald McKay in 1991. This theory says that connections between semantic and phonological nodes weaken when they are not used. The neural signal fades before it can trigger the sound form. There is no blocking word. The bridge simply degrades. This explains why proper names are more vulnerable. A common noun like table appears in many contexts. Its connections are reinforced daily. A proper name like Mr. Jenkins connects to only one face. That pathway is thin and rarely traveled. The transmission deficit hypothesis predicts more tip-of-the-tongue states for low-frequency words and for older adults. Burke and McKay tested this in their 1991 experiment. They showed that older adults had more TOTS for famous names, but not for common objects. The deficit was specific to infrequent connections. The two theories, blocking and transmission deficit, are not mutually exclusive. Both may operate. The blocking hypothesis accounts for cases where an intruder word surfaces. The transmission deficit accounts for cases where the pathway is simply weak. The brain uses both mechanisms, and the experience of a tip-of-the-tongue state may arise from either. Another factor is the frequency of use. Proper names are often used less frequently than common nouns. Each time you retrieve a name, the neural pathway strengthens. But if you only meet a person once a year, the pathway weakens. The brain's retrieval system relies on practice. That is why you almost never forget your own mother's name, but you might forget the name of an old coworker from a decade ago. Tip of the tongue states increase with age. Older adults experience them more often, not because their memory is failing overall, but because the connections between semantics and phonology become slower. The same layered system works, but the bridge takes longer to form. Cross-linguistic research offers another layer of evidence. In 2008, psychologist Tamar Golan and her colleagues studied bilingual speakers in San Diego. They found that bilinguals experience tip-of-the-tongue states more often than monolinguals, even when using their stronger language. The reason is competition. When a bilingual tries to retrieve a word, both languages activate candidate sounds. Similar-sounding words from the other language can intrude and block the target. This supports the blocking hypothesis in a cross-linguistic context, but it also reveals a limit. The tip-of-the-tongue state is not always a failure of one language. It can be a conflict between two mental dictionaries. Bilinguals often report knowing the first letter in one language, but not the other. The feeling of knowing splits across languages. This underscores the layered nature of memory. The semantic layer is shared between languages, but each language has its own phonological layer. When the two layers conflict, the retrieval fails. This finding also explains why bilinguals sometimes have a tip-of-the-tongue state for a word they know perfectly well in one language, but cannot access in the other. A famous experiment from 1991 by psychologists Deborah Burke and Donald McKay tested this. They asked participants to name pictures of famous people and common objects. Older adults had more tip-of-the-tongue states for proper names than for common nouns, but their ability to recall the faces or recognize the objects was intact. The breakdown was specific to the sound layer. This suggests that tip-of-the-tongue is not a failure of memory storage. It is a failure of retrieval. The information is still there. It just cannot be reached at that moment. This is why the answer often pops into your head minutes or hours later when you have stopped trying. The brain's retrieval system, now relaxed, finds a new pathway. Neuroimaging has since confirmed the brain areas involved. A 2001 study led by Anat Merrill used functional MRI to scan participants during tip-of-the-tongue states. Participants were shown definitions and asked to indicate when they felt a taut. The brain scans showed increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the left prefrontal cortex. These regions are associated with conflict monitoring and cognitive control. The taut state, the scans suggested, is a signal of conflict between the feeling of knowing and the inability to produce the word. The anterior cingulate detects the mismatch. The prefrontal cortex tries to resolve it by searching for the missing sound. This explains the feeling of effort you experience. Your brain is actively trying to resolve the block. The anterior cingulate is the same region that activates when you notice an error or when two responses compete. The taut state is a specific kind of conflict. Your brain knows it knows, but cannot output the word. The scan also showed that the left temporal lobe, which stores phonological information, showed reduced activity. The sound layer is not fully accessible. The neural pattern matches the behavioral findings from Brown and McNeill decades earlier. But there is a limit to this picture. Not every tip-of-the-tongue state is genuine. Sometimes you feel certain you know a word, but the word you later retrieve is wrong. This is called a false tip-of-the-tongue state. In a 1997 study by researchers at the University of Colorado, participants were asked to recall answers to trivia questions. Those who claimed to be in a tip-of-the-tongue state were then given a list of plausible answers. Over a third chose the wrong answer, even when they felt highly confident. The feeling of knowing can be an illusion. The brain's subjective sensation of closeness does not guarantee accuracy. It only indicates that the semantic layer is active. The actual sound may belong to a completely different word. Tip-of-the-tongue states also affect social interaction. When you cannot recall a name mid-conversation, you may feel embarrassed. People often try to hide the block by using vague phrases like, that guy. This avoidance strategy works, but does not help retrieval. A better social strategy is to acknowledge the block openly. Studies show that listeners often empathize and may even supply the name. In a 2016 study by psychologists at the University of York, participants who openly said, "It's on the tip of my tongue," were rated as more likable than those who pretended. The shared effort to retrieve the name strengthens the social bond. The tip of the tongue state is a universal experience. Recognizing it as a normal retrieval glitch rather than a social failure reduces the anxiety that can worsen the block. This insight can make the experience less frustrating and more manageable in daily life. This insight connects to the real world. When you cannot recall a name, your brain often gives you a partial cue. You might know the first letter or the number of syllables. That cue is real. It comes from the phonological layer being partially activated. The feeling of frustration you experience is also real. It is a signal from your brain that retrieval is in progress. The more you try to force it, the more you reinforce the block. The best strategy is to stop trying. Distract yourself. Let your brain work in the background. This is why names often come back when you are doing something unrelated, like showering or driving. The brain, released from direct effort, can explore alternative pathways. The phenomenon has a clear evolutionary function. Memory is built for efficiency, not perfect recall. Storing every detail with equal strength would waste resources. The brain prioritizes meaning over sound. You are more likely to remember that a person is a doctor than that their name is Smith. This trade-off works in most situations. When you need to describe something, you can use words with synonyms. But proper names are a special case. They are the one part of language where sound and meaning are arbitrary. The brain has no alternative route to a proper name. If the bridge fails, you are stuck. So why does your brain hold that name hostage? Because retrieval is a cascade, not a switch. The semantic layer opens first. The phonological layer may lag behind or fail to open at all. The name is not lost. It is simply disconnected from the sound that would let you speak it. The feeling you experience, the ache, the empty shape, the partial letter, all of it is the brain's way of telling you that the rest of the word is there, just not reachable yet. Next time you feel that familiar frustration, remember, the name is not gone. It is waiting for the right connection to finish the journey.